A woman was weeping on her knees in the snow, dying on a mountain she did not know. Gideon Hayes stepped out of the spruce to save her. He did not know yet that the small black book sewn into her coat carried the name of the man who had murdered his father 15 years before. This is how the reckoning began. The wind carried a sound that did not belong on the mountain. Gideon Hayes stopped in the deep snow, his breath freezing into a pale cloud before his face. He was 6 feet 5 inches of muscle and silence, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat the color of dried tobacco, with a Winchester rifle resting easy across his forearm like it had been born there. Around him, the San Juan Range rose in cathedrals of white stone and black timber, indifferent to the small troubles of men. It was late November in the year of our Lord, 1883, and the mountain was preparing to kill whatever was foolish enough to remain upon it. He had been tracking a wounded elk since dawn. A good clean shot to the lungs maybe 3 miles back down the ridge, and the animal had run on pure stubbornness, bleeding out in a long, ragged line of rust, red drops across the crust of new snow. Gideon did not waste meat. He did not waste lead. He followed the blood with the patient devotion of a man who had learned long ago that every living thing owed a debt of finish to whatever it had started. But the blood had led him here to a bend in the ravine below Silver Ridge, and the blood was no longer the only story written in the snow. There was a footprint. It was small, delicate, the heel of a lady's traveling boot pressed down into the crust and half covered by fresh powder, which meant it was not old. A few hours at most. The toe pointed west toward the old Cochrane claim, where no living soul had dwelled since the fever took the prospector 6 winters back. Beside the footprint, half-buried a piece of paper that had once been a letter lay crumpled and stained. Gideon did not bend to pick it up. Not yet. He only looked at it and at the print and at the faint green smoke he now saw rising above the timber a quarter-mile further on. Greenwood smoke, a signal fire no seasoned man on this mountain would ever light by choice. Someone was in the Cochrane cabin, someone small, someone who did not know what the mountain was. Gideon tightened his grip on the Winchester and began to move, and behind him, unseen, the first clouds of the season's true storm were already gathering over the western peaks like a fist preparing to fall. Before we go any further, friend, if this is your first time around the fire, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. I tell stories like this one every week, stories of the wild country and the men and women who earned it with their own 2 hands. And while you are there, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. I like to know who is riding along beside me. Now let us get back to the mountain because the blood is still cooling on the snow, and the woman in the cabin does not yet know how close death has come. The Hayes brothers had built their home on the high shoulder of Silver Ridge, a full day's hard ride from Telluride, and they had built it the way a man builds a thing he means to die in. 2 stories of stacked pines squared and notched by hand with a stone chimney wide enough to roast a whole deer over, and a roof pitched steep enough to shed 10 feet of snow without a groan. They called it 3 Pines Cabin on account of the 3 great trees standing sentinel at the front door, and the 3 brothers who had come up the mountain together 10 long years ago and had not come down since. Gideon was the eldest at 34. He was a quiet man, and the quiet in him was the kind that had been earned, not inherited. He had gone off to the war between the states at 15 years old, a drummer boy in a Union regiment, small enough that his colonel had nearly sent him home twice. He did not get sent home. He saw Petersburg. He saw Appomattox. He saw a cousin die with his hand in Gideon's hand, asking for his mother, and Gideon had lied and said she was coming because it was the only mercy he had to give. When he came back to Denver in the spring of 1865, he was still a boy in years, but something inside him had been playing smooth and hard like a rifle stock that would never warp again. He spoke little, he meant every word, and he had loved precisely once in his life a woman named Sarah Monroe, and Sarah Monroe was 10 years dead. Callum was 33. He was the hunter of the 3, and he had a tracker's eyes, the kind that saw too much and forgave too little. Where Gideon was still water, Callum was a fast creek and spring, restless, sharp, prone to laughter that came a half-breath before it cut. He had a scar beneath his chin from a Bowie knife fight in a mining camp outside Leadville, and he was the only one of the brothers who still carried the old anger of their boyhood out where a person could see it. He loved his brothers fiercely. He trusted no one else. Ezra was 32, the youngest. He had gone east once to study medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and he had made it 2 years before his mother's long final illness called him home in the winter of 1870. He still had a doctor's hands long-fingered and careful, and he still kept a worn copy of Gray's Anatomy on the shelf above the stove beside their mother's King James Bible. Ezra was the one who read. Ezra was the one who healed. Ezra was the one who, when their mother had lain dying of the lung fever in that bitter winter, had sat with her through every night for 3 months without sleeping longer than an hour at a stretch. There was a gentleness in Ezra, and there was a steel behind the gentleness, and people who mistook the first for the absence of the second were reliably surprised. 15 years before the night in question in the spring of 1868, the brothers had a father named Thaddeus Hayes. He had been a banker in Denver, an honest man in a dishonest town, and the railroad men had decided he was standing on land they meant to have. The newspapers called it a holdup gone wrong. The newspapers were wrong. The brothers knew it. They had never been able to prove it. And 10 years later, when Sarah Monroe had been shot down in a Denver alley in what the authorities called an armed robbery by an unknown gang, Gideon had known in the deepest quiet chamber of himself that the same hand had signed her death as had signed his father's. He had kept that knowing locked up inside his chest for a decade. He had not spoken it aloud, not even to his brothers. Especially not to his brothers, because he had already lost too much and he could not stand to lose them. So the three Hayes brothers lived on the mountain, and they hunted and they trapped and they worked a small silver claim that paid enough to keep them in powder and coffee, and they trusted no man in a suit and polished boots, and they had, as far as the world was concerned, finished with the business of loving women. Which is why the green smoke rising from the old Cochrane cabin was on that particular afternoon a problem. On the mountain, a man can only trust his own blood and his own Winchester. Gideon had said that to his brothers more times than any of them could count. He said it now quietly to himself as he moved through the blue spruce with the silent rolling step of a practiced hunter. The wind had shifted. He could smell the smoke clearly now. Pine sap too fresh. Whoever was burning that wood had cut it green, which meant they did not know any better, which meant they were not an outlaw or a seasoned claim jumper, which meant most likely they were going to die within the week unless someone interfered. He did not want to interfere. He had a rule about interfering, but he kept moving toward the smoke anyway, because a man can hold a rule and still know when to break it, and that is one of the differences between a man and a stone. He came through the last stand of spruce and parted the heavy snow-laden branches with the barrel of his rifle, and for a long moment he forgot entirely how to breathe. There was a woman. She was standing in front of the sagging Cochrane cabin, and she was swinging a rusted axe at a frozen pine stump with the kind of desperate fury that belongs only to people who have run out of other options. She was not dressed for the mountain. She was wearing a long wool coat that had plainly been cut for a man twice her size, and the hem of it dragged in the snow behind her like a dark stain. Her hands were wrapped in torn strips of burlap. Her hair, what he could see of it beneath the hood, was the color of clover honey in a jar held up to the sun. Her cheeks were burned red by the cold, and she was shaking so badly that each swing of the axe missed the stump entirely by 3 or 4 inches, biting into the crust of the snow and sending up a small white plume. She swung. She missed. She swung again. She missed again. And then she stopped. And she dropped the axe. And she sank to her knees in the snow and she wept. She did not weep the way women wept in parlors in Denver. She wept the way a person weeps when they have understood very suddenly that no one at all is coming to save them. She pressed her burlap-wrapped hands over her mouth to keep the sound in, because somewhere inside her, even now, there was a Boston woman who had been taught that weeping was a private matter. And that small, stubborn dignity maintained in front of a stump and a rusted axe in a mountain that did not care went into Gideon Hayes like a knife blade between the ribs. He could have turned and left. A wiser man would have. A man who was still obeying all his own rules would have. He stepped out from the tree line. The crunch of his boot on the crusted snow was louder than a rifle shot in the still afternoon. The woman's head came up. For one held breath, she only stared at him, a pale oval of a face with two enormous blue eyes inside it, and then she was scrambling backward on her hands and the heels of her boots, her gloved hands digging frantically into the oversized pockets of her coat. By the time he had taken his second step, she had produced with trembling hands a heavy rusted Colt Patterson revolver that looked older than she was. She gripped it with both hands and leveled it at the middle of his chest. "Stay where you are," she said. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried. "I swear before God, mister, I will put a hole straight through you." Gideon stopped. He did not raise his rifle. He did not lower it either. He only looked at her and at the revolver and at the shaking of her hands, and he spoke in the low, steady voice he used with frightened horses. "Ma'am, that hammer is rusted clean shut. I reckon it has been rusted since before I was born, and even if it was not, your hands are shaking so bad you could not hit the broad side of a barn from the inside." She blinked at him. A tear tracked down her wind-burned cheek, and she did not seem to notice it. "Who sent you?" she demanded. "Was it Blackwood? You tell him I would sooner die up here than go back. You tell him that." And there on the ridge above the old Cochrane claim, in the thin afternoon light of a dying November, Gideon Hayes felt the name Blackwood strike him like a slug of cold lead to the sternum. His face did not change. He had learned long ago never to let his face change at the important moments. But something deep and long, sleeping inside his chest, had just opened one eye. "Nobody sent me," he said quietly. "I live up the ridge. I saw your smoke." He unslung a brace of freshly trapped snowshoe hairs from his shoulder and laid them slowly onto the snow, halfway between himself and the shaking woman. Then he straightened, keeping his hands plainly visible. "You are burning green pine," he said. "It will smoke you out of that cabin in your sleep, and the smell will draw every hungry wolf within 10 miles before nightfall. I will split you some dry wood and leave it on the stump. Do not come looking for me. I will not come back." He did not wait for her to answer. He turned his back on the revolver, which was a calculated risk, and he walked to a deadfall branch at the edge of the clearing, and he split it into neat dry lengths with 4 clean strokes of his hatchet. He stacked the wood on the stump beside the rabbits. Then he melted back into the spruce without a word, and he was gone. He did not go home. He climbed instead to a bluff above the ravine, and he crouched there in the shelter of a great gray boulder, and he watched. He watched until he saw the woman creep out from the cabin door on legs that would not quite steady her. He watched her kick the dead hares once as if to be certain they were not some trick. He watched her gather them into her coat with a small, shuddering cry, and then gather the split wood, and then stand for a long moment with her face turned up toward the ridge as if she were trying to see him, as if she were trying to say a thing she did not have any words for. Then she went inside and she shut the door, and a moment later the smoke above the cabin thinned and whitened and climbed straight and clean. She had used the dry wood. Good. She had a chance now, a small one. Gideon watched a while longer. The sky to the west was turning the color of a fresh bruise. A storm was coming, and it was coming then heavy. And somewhere in a city he did not live, and a man named Blackwood had sent this girl running for her life. He turned and started up the ridge to fetch his brothers. Now there is a great deal to be said of a woman who will point a rusted revolver at a man twice her size in the snow, and most of it is good. But to understand what drove Eliza Whitmore into that cabin on that afternoon, we must leave the mountain for a moment and travel 900 miles east to a narrow house on a cobbled street in Boston where the story of the thing had begun. Eliza Whitmore was 23 years old. She was the younger daughter of Judge Alistair Whitmore, a man respected by everyone in the Suffolk County Courthouse for a quarter of a century, And she had grown up in the sheltered, particular way of a well-bred Bostonian girl with a governess who taught her French and a grandmother from County Cork who taught her how to set a broken rabbit bone with a splint of cedar wood and how to read the weather from the behavior of the chimney smoke. Her mother had died when Eliza was 7. Her father had raised her and her sister Clara on honor scripture, the music of Stephen Foster, and the absolute conviction that the law was the one fence between civilization and the wolf. In May of that same year, 1883, her father had died suddenly of a stroke at his bench. And the bench, it turned out, did not leave its daughters a fortune. It left them a mortgaged house and a stack of bills from his final illness, and the understanding, as certain as winter, that respectable unmarried women in Boston did not long remain respectable when they had no money. Clara had done what she believed she had to do. 2 years prior, in 1881, she had married a man named Josiah Blackwood, who was the chief enforcement officer for the Western Pacific Railroad, and who was the wealthiest suitor who had ever walked up the Whitmore steps. Clara had not loved him. Clara had understood him in the way smart women sometimes understand dangerous men, and she had married him to save her father's house and Eliza's future in the last shred of the family name. Eliza had held her sister's hands the morning of the wedding and had whispered into her hair that she did not have to do this. Clara had smiled a small, tired smile that Eliza would remember for the rest of her life, and she had said, "Someone in this family has to be the practical one, little bird, and it was never going to be you." 3 months later, in the August following their father's death, Clara had sent Eliza a letter. The letter was not a letter any woman should have had to write. Clara had found a ledger in her husband's private study, a small black leather book bound in oiled calfskin, kept in a drawer behind a false panel in his desk. The ledger was a record in Josiah Blackwood's own hand of 8 separate, arranged tragedies he had engineered for the Western Pacific Railroad over the previous 15 years. Among them was the Durango payroll train derailment of the prior winter, in which 10 men had died and $80,000 in railroad script had vanished into Blackwood's accounts. The papers had called it a tragic accident. It had not been an accident. Clara wrote all of this to her sister in a hand that shook visibly on the page, and she begged Eliza to be careful. And she said that she did not know yet what she was going to do, only that she could no longer stand to drink her morning coffee across from him without tasting the iron of it. 2 weeks later, Clara Whitmore Blackwood was found at the foot of the main staircase in her husband's Back Bay mansion with a broken neck. The papers called it a tragic accident. The papers were once again wrong. Eliza had gone to the house during the wake when Josiah was receiving condolences in the front parlor, and she had gone up to her sister's dressing room, and she had lifted the lid of the music box their mother had given them both when they were small, the one that played Beautiful Dreamer when you wound it. Inside the velvet-lined compartment beneath the movement, where she and Clara had once hidden childhood secrets, she had found a small black leather ledger. Clara, even at the end, had thought of her little bird. Eliza had left Boston that night with a carpet bag, the ledger sewn into the lining of a man's wool coat she had bought from a rag dealer, and the last of her father's gold concealed inside the spine of her mother's Bible. She had fled first to Albany, then to Chicago. Then, because Josiah Blackwood had advertised in every Pinkerton bulletin from New York to Kansas City a bounty of $5,000 for her return, she had kept going west. In a boarding house in St. Louis, a kindly woman who ran the place had pressed into her hand a folded page torn from a matrimonial gazette called the Matrimonial News. There was a single advertisement circled in pencil: Mr. Gideon Hayes of Silver Ridge, Colorado, seeking a woman of strong character, willing to share a remote mountain homestead. No photograph required. Reply in care of Telluride Post Office. It was Eliza had thought a prayer in the shape of a paragraph. She had answered it that same night. She had signed the letter with her true name because something in the brief wording of the advertisement had told her that a man who put so few words on paper was not a man who would stand for a lie. She had received a reply within 2 weeks directing her to the Cochrane claim and instructions for the stage and a rough hand-drawn map. She had taken the train as far as Alamosa and then a Wells Fargo stagecoach as far as it would go, And then with the last of the light failing on her first afternoon on the mountain, she had walked the final 3 miles to the address on the map, dragging her carpet bag through snow that was already above her ankles. What she had found was not a homestead. What she had found was a collapsing one-room prospector's shack, with its doors sagged on a single hinge, and its roof half given way, and a cold hearth thick with bird droppings, and no husband, and no provisions, and no soul within shouting distance. She had understood, standing in that doorway, that she had been deceived. She had understood it the way one understands a sudden cold current pulling one under. But she had also understood that she could not, in the middle of winter on a mountain, she did not know, simply lie down and die. So she had swept the cabin out with her bare hands. She had lit a fire with damp green wood because she did not know the difference. She had eaten the last of the hardtack from her carpet bag. She had slept with her father's revolver unloaded and rusted clutched to her chest. And on the third morning, her small store of food gone and her hands already going black at the fingertips from the early stages of frostbite, she had gone out to try to chop a stump she could not possibly chop, because to sit still and wait was to agree to die, and Eliza Whitmore, whatever else she was, had not yet agreed. Which is how she came to be weeping on her knees in the snow, when a shadow the size of a black bear stepped out of the spruce and spoke to her in a voice like smoke over gravel. Now we return to the mountain, for the men are moving now, and the snow is beginning to fall in earnest. Callum Hayes was breaking down a deer carcass at the back of the smokehouse when his elder brother came up the path at a walk that to Callum's trained eye was not quite his brother's ordinary walk. Ezra, who was splitting kindling in the lee of the cabin, straightened and set down his axe before Gideon had said a word. The brothers had lived together on the mountain long enough that they could read one another the way other men read the weather. "Found smoke down at the Cochran place," Gideon said. "No preamble. Green pine. Somebody's in there," claimed Jumper, Callum said at once with a quick flash of teeth. "Want me to go flush him?" Gideon did not answer immediately. He looked at the darkening western sky. He looked at his brothers. And then in the quiet way he said, not a him, a woman, alone. No gear, no food, no sense about the wood. Boston, by the way she speaks. And she had a Patterson revolver pulled on me inside of 30 seconds of seeing my face. Callum's grin vanished. Ezra went very still. "She used a name," Gideon said. He paused. His voice went one half step lower, which for Gideon was the vocal equivalent of another man pounding the table. "She asked me if I had been sent by a man named Blackwood." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The mountain wind rose and fell in the pines above their heads. It was Ezra at length who said quietly, "Blackwood is not a common name, Gideon." "It is not," Gideon said. And the name hung in the cold air between the three of them, like something that had been waiting 15 years for a door to open. They went down together, the three brothers, in the last hour before the true storm. They moved fast through the darkening timber, and they moved without talking, because talk was not necessary. Callum went wide to the east to cut off the ravine. Ezra went wide to the west with his medical bag over his shoulder because he had heard the word frostbite in his brother's description, and he had not liked it. Gideon went straight down the middle up to the door of the sagging cabin, and he stopped 10 yards out in the gathering snow, and he called, "Ma'am, it is the man from this afternoon. I have brought my brothers. We mean you no harm. There is a blizzard coming in, and you will not live through the night in that cabin." There was no answer from inside, only the thin sound of the wind whirring the broken door. "Ma'am," Gideon said again, a small sound, something between a breath and a word. Then the door opened just a crack, and Eliza Whitmore looked out at him with eyes that had gone past fear into the quiet, flat country that lies on the far side of it. Her lips were blue. The burlap strips on her hands were stiff with ice. "You brought," she whispered, and then she seemed unable to finish the sentence. Her gaze had moved past him to Callum, emerging from the spruce on her left, and then to Ezra, appearing from the spruce on her right. Three enormous men in buffalo coats who were to her fevered vision indistinguishable from one another, as though her exhaustion had printed the same image 3 times upon the page of the world. She put a hand to the door frame to steady herself. "Three," she said faintly. "There are three of you." "Yes, ma'am," Ezra said gently, and he moved first because that was his way. "Three of us, Hayes brothers out of Silver Ridge, and you with respect are about 2 hours from dying of exposure. We are going to take you up to our cabin. Do you understand what I am saying?" She tried to answer, and the answer did not reach her mouth. Ezra was across the clearing in 4 long strides, and he was catching her as her knees went out from under her, gathering her into the crook of his arm as though she weighed nothing at all. Callum was already moving past him into the cabin, scooping up her thin carpet bag and the heavy wool coat that had fallen from her shoulders. As Ezra lifted her, the coat tipped sideways, and something white slipped out of an inner pocket and fluttered to the snow at Gideon's boots. It was a letter, folded, water-stained, the original reply she had received in St. Louis. Gideon bent and picked it up because his brother was holding the woman, and Callum was holding her bag, and someone had to. He turned the folded page over in his gloved hand, and his eye caught on the signature at the bottom, and everything inside his chest, which had been moving in its usual orderly way, stopped for the space of one long heartbeat. The advertisement in the matrimonial news had been placed in his name, Mr. Gideon Hayes, Silver Ridge, Colorado. He had never placed any such advertisement. He had never dictated it, written it, spoken of it, or considered it for a single moment in his life. But the looping, careful hand at the bottom of the reply letter, the hand that had signed the delivery instructions and the rough map, that hand he knew. He had seen that hand on a dozen letters sitting folded in the bottom drawer of his father's old roll-top desk back at Three Pines cabin. He had seen that hand on the report 15 years old that named the 7 men suspected of involvement in Thaddeus Hayes' killing. It was the hand of United States Marshal Cyrus Cook, chief lawman, out of Denver and oldest living friend of the Hayes family. Gideon stood very still in the falling snow, with the letter in his hand, and he understood all at once, and without any doubt, that his father's oldest friend had, for reasons of his own, chosen this particular mountain and these particular 3 brothers to hide this particular woman upon. Cyrus Cook had forged his name on an advertisement and sent Eliza Whitmore running from Josiah Blackwood directly into the hands of the only 3 men in the Colorado high country who had a 15-year-old reason to want Blackwood dead. He folded the letter, he put it inside his coat. He looked up. His brothers were watching him, waiting because they had seen his face change, and that did not happen. "Get her up the mountain," Gideon said in a voice like the closing of a heavy door. "Get her warm. Get her fed. We will talk about the rest of it when she wakes." And then the snow began to fall in earnest, great soft sideways sheets of it, that turned the last blue of the sky the color of old iron, and the first true storm of the winter of 1883 came down upon the San Juan Range like a hand closing into a fist. The 3 brothers climbed back up Silver Ridge with the woman between them. Gideon carried her for the first half. Ezra carried her for the second half because Ezra was the one who could feel her pulse through her wrist as he walked, and he was the one who knew precisely how close she was running to the edge of something he would not be able to bring her back from. Callum walked behind them, his rifle in his hands and his eyes on the dark timber they were leaving, because Callum had smelled a name on the wind tonight that he had not smelled in 15 years, and he did not intend to be surprised from behind. They reached Three Pines cabin as the last light failed. The fire in the hearth banked that morning was coaxed back to a roaring life. Ezra did everything he knew to do for a person brought in from the cold, which was considerable. He rubbed her hands between his long fingers until the blood came back into them in ugly blotches of returning color. He warmed stones in the coals and wrapped them in flannel and laid them at her feet and beneath her arm. He heated broth from the stock pot and fed her 1 small spoon at a time while she slipped in and out of fevered sleep. She said very little. She said the same few things over and over in the disconnected way of a person drifting far below the surface of herself. She said the name Clara. She said the word ledger. She said the number 80,000 and the name Blackwood, and the word Durango and the name of a man she called Josiah. And once very clearly she said, "I saw it. He killed him. I saw it," before she slipped under again. Callum, who had been standing at the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, turned slowly and looked at Ezra. 80,000, Callum said. Durango, Ezra said. $80,000, Callum said again, very quietly. The payroll train out of Durango last winter, the one they called an accident. Ezra's steady hand wavered for perhaps the first time that night above the edge of the broth bowl. He set the bowl down and he did not pick it up again. Gideon was not in the room. Gideon was on the porch in the thickening snow with the letter in Cyrus Cook's hand held open in his fingers and the wind pulling at the corner of the page. He stood there a long time. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about Sarah Monroe. He was thinking about 15 years of evidence he had gathered and hidden and never been able to turn into anything that would hang a man in a Denver courtroom. He was thinking about a slight young woman with honey-colored hair in the next room, a woman who had, by the evidence of her own fevered mouth, seen what he had spent 15 years trying to prove. He was thinking about the fact that the universe, as his father had sometimes said in the old days before the railroads came, occasionally did clear its throat, and when it did, a man ought to listen. He folded the letter. He put it away inside his coat. He walked back inside and closed the door on the storm. That night the wind rose to a scream along the eaves of Three Pines' cabin. The snow piled 3 feet deep against the south wall in the space of 6 hours. Ezra sat beside the bed where Eliza Whitmore slept, and he watched the slow return of color to her cheeks. Callum sat in the rocker by the fire with his rifle across his knees and a faraway expression that Gideon had not seen on his brother's face since they were young. And Gideon himself, eldest of the Hayes brothers, keeper of the old ghosts, sat at the rough pine table with a lantern burning low and a small black leather ledger open before him, because Ezra, in the process of warming the woman, had found it sewn into the lining of the man's wool coat, and they had all 3 of them understood what it was the moment they saw it. He opened to the first entry. The first entry in the first ledger of the private business of Josiah Blackwood, Chief Enforcement Officer of the Western Pacific Railroad. The page was dated March 12, 1868. The handwriting was precise. The handwriting was neat. The handwriting said, Hayes Thaddeus, Denver, $12,000, completed. Gideon Hayes sat alone with his father's name written in the hand of the man who had killed him, and he did not weep because weeping was a country he had stopped visiting a long time ago. He only set one large, calloused finger very gently upon the page, over the letters of his father's name, as though he could cover the wound with his own hand. Outside on the dark mountain, the storm was only beginning to gather its strength. In a railway office 800 miles to the east, a man in a tailored black suit was already reading a telegram from a Pinkerton agent in St. Louis, and he was already making a list of the men he would send west. And in the small warm room behind Gideon, a woman from Boston slept the deep sleep of the nearly drowned, and she did not yet know that the mountain had already decided to keep her, and that the storm outside was the smallest of the storms that were coming. Gideon closed the ledger. He closed his eyes. After a while, in a voice so quiet that only he heard it, he said into the lamplight, "All right, Father. All right, Sarah. I hear you." And somewhere on a ridge in the San Juan Mountains, under a sky gone black with weather, a door that had been shut for 15 years had quietly, without anyone noticing, begun to open. She woke to the smell of pine smoke and broth. For a long, slow moment, Eliza Whitmore did not know where she was. She lay beneath a weight of wool blankets in a heavy buffalo robe, and the air above her face was warm in the way only the air in a well-built cabin with a good fire can be warm. And somewhere nearby, a log settled in a stove with a small dry crack. Her hands were wrapped in clean linen. Her feet were wrapped in clean linen. She could feel her toes, which was the first piece of information her returning mind decided to notice. And each toe hurt in a separate, specific way, which meant that they were all still attached, and that was on the whole good news. She turned her head on the pillow, which was stuffed with something that crinkled, likely dried pine needles for the scent of them, and she saw a man sitting beside her bed. He was reading a book. He was a mountain of a man, folded carefully into a straight-backed wooden chair, long legs crossed at the ankles. one large hand holding the book open and the other resting on his thigh. He had a lamp turned low on the nightstand beside him. His hair was chestnut brown and must from his fingers running through it, and there was no scar on his face. It occurred to Eliza distantly that she had fallen asleep afraid of three men and had woken to one, and that the one was watching over her with a book in his hand, as though he had all the time in the world and nothing more pressing to do with it. Ezra Hayes heard her breathing change before she made any sound. He closed the book on his finger to mark the page, and he set it gently on the nightstand, and he turned to her with the kind of unhurried attention that good doctors acquire after their first winter of losing patience in the small hours. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was the softest of the three she half remembered. "You have been our guest for the better part of 3 days. Do not try to sit up yet. You are not going to like it." She tried to sit up anyway. She did not like it. Ezra was ready with a hand beneath her shoulder. He eased her back onto the pillow with the practiced gentleness of a man who had been easing people back onto pillows since he was 20 years old. He poured water from an earthenware pitcher into a tin cup. He held the cup for her while she drank because her hands, though warm now, were still not steady. She drank the whole cup. She wanted a second. He gave her half of one and then set the rest aside. "Too much at once will sicken you," he said. "You have been taking only broth. Your body has forgotten what to do with the rest." Eliza looked at him. She looked at the low, rough beam ceiling above her. She looked at the pegs on the wall where a man's flannel shirts hung in a neat row. The shirt she was wearing, she realized belatedly, was one of them sleeves rolled twice at the cuffs to keep her hands free. Her cheeks went hot for a moment, and Ezra, being Ezra, turned his eyes politely to the window and cleared his throat. "Your clothes are clean and folded on the chest at the foot of the bed," he said, speaking to the glass. "My elder brother handled the thaw. I handled the doctoring. No one was anywhere they were not required to be. You have my word on it, and my brother's word with it, which is worth somewhat more." "Thank you," Eliza said. Her voice had come back rough, but it had come back. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Sure." "Ezra, please," he said, still speaking to the window. "There are 3 Mr. Hayes in this cabin, and it becomes confusing." She almost smiled. It surprised her that she still could. By the time the door at the end of the hall opened and his brothers came in, she had managed to sit up against the piled pillows, and Ezra had combed her honey-colored hair gently back from her face with his fingers and tied it in a loose knot at the base of her neck with a length of leather cord, because hair in the face of a recovering patient, he said, was an indignity a person did not need. Gideon came in first, ducking under the low door, and Callum came in behind him with a tray of bread and more broth, and astonishingly a small dish of preserved peaches from a jar with a faded handwritten label pasted on the side. Callum set the tray on the nightstand, and then, with the careful seriousness of a man who was trying very hard not to hover, retreated to stand beside the window with his arms folded across his chest. The 3 of them looked at her. She looked at the 3 of them. She understood now that she had not been dreaming. They truly were identical. 3 pairs of whiskey amber eyes, 3 strong square jaws, 3 broad shoulders crowding this small warm room. She could tell them apart now only by the details Ezra had pointed out when he named them for her a moment earlier. Gideon was the one with the long, clean scar across his left cheek. Callum was the one with the small scar beneath his chin. Ezra was the one with no scar on his face at all, the one sitting beside her, the one with the book. Gideon sat down on the wooden bench opposite the foot of the bed. He leaned his forearms on his knees. He looked at her a long moment, not unkindly, the way a man looks at a problem he has decided to solve rather than avoid. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "we need to know how much you remember telling us these past 3 days, and we need to know what is still true now that your fever has broken." She drew a breath. The breath hurt a little. She was aware of Ezra's careful watching beside her, the way a good brother watches a good doctor ready to intervene if the doctor pushed the patient too hard. She was aware of Callum at the window, silent outwardly, still though his jaw was working in a small, slow rhythm that suggested a man holding something down by force. She told them, She told them about her father dying in May. She told them about Clara marrying Josiah Blackwood in 1881 to save the family. She told them about the letter in August, the small black ledger in the music box, the broken neck at the bottom of the staircase the papers had called a tragic accident. She told them about running from Boston with the ledger sewn into the lining of the second-hand man's coat. She told them about St. Louis and the circled advertisement in the matrimonial news. She told them about the Cochrane cabin and the 3 days without food and the rusted revolver in the stump. When she had finished, none of them spoke for a long moment. Outside the small, thick-paned window, the snow had stopped falling at last, and the sun was coming up over the eastern shoulder of Silver Ridge in a long, clean line of gold. Gideon reached inside his heavy flannel shirt. He took out the small black ledger. Her breath caught. She had not seen it since before the cabin. She had half believed in her fever that she had imagined it. Miss Whitmore, Gideon said, I am going to ask you one hard question, and I want you to answer honest. Did you read past the first few pages of this? She shook her head slowly. I opened it only enough to see that it was his. I did not dare carry it open. I thought if I read it, I would not have the strength to run with it. Gideon nodded once as though she had answered correctly on a question he already knew the answer to. Then he opened the ledger to its first page, and he turned the ledger around on his knee so that she could see it, and he set his broad forefinger gently on the topmost entry. Hayes Thaddeus, Denver, $12,000, completed. The 12th of March, 1868. Eliza read the line. She read it again. Her eyes rose slowly from the page to Gideon's face and then past him to Ezra and then past Ezra to Callum by the window. And in that moment, without any of them saying a word, she understood why her arrival on this mountain had felt from the first like the hand of something larger than herself bringing her here. My father was a banker in Denver, Gideon said quietly. He would not sell his land to the Western Pacific. 15 years ago this spring, he was killed in what the papers called a holdup gone wrong. We have known in our bones for 15 years that it was not a holdup. We could never prove it. He laid his palm flat over his father's name on the page. Now we can. The room went very still. Callum spoke at last from his place by the window. His voice was rougher than his brother's. There is a page further on, ma'am. An entry from 1873. You can tell her, Gideon, or I will. Gideon turned the pages. He turned them slowly as a man turns pages of something that hurts him. He stopped. He held the book up. Eliza saw the entry. She did not know the name. But she saw that Gideon's hand on the ledger had gone white across the knuckles. Monroe Sarah, Gideon said, and his voice did a thing his voice did not usually do. It thinned. Denver, $400, completed, the 22nd of October, 1873. Eliza looked at him. She did not understand yet, but she saw his face and she understood that whatever this was, it was nearly unbearable. Sarah Monroe, Ezra said softly from beside her, was the woman my brother was to marry. She was shot dead in a Denver alley 10 years ago this month. They told us it was an armed robbery by an unknown gang. Her father had been a witness in the hearing about our own father's death. He had told the coroner quietly that he believed Josiah Blackwood was behind it. A week after Sarah died, her chaplain, whose name was Amos Monroe, stopped speaking of the matter altogether and moved to California. And my brother Ezra added, and he paused a moment and looked at Gideon with an expression of such old quiet grief that Eliza's throat ached. My brother has been hunting the truth of both those deaths for 10 years on this mountain alone, because he would not risk the two of us to it. Callum spoke again from the window. His voice was not loud. It was in fact very soft. But there was a thing in it that made the hair stand up on Eliza's arms. 10 years, Gideon, Callum said. 10 years you sat across that pine table from us every night and never said. 10 years. Gideon did not look at him. I could not bury you too, Gideon said. Not after him, not after her. I could not. There was a silence so long and so heavy in the small, warm room that Eliza could hear the fire speak in the hearth down the hall. Then Callum walked the 2 strides to the bed, and he set his large hand on his elder brother's shoulder, and he squeezed it once hard. and he did not speak because there were no words between them that had not already been said in that one touch. Gideon covered his brother's hand with his own for the space of one breath. Then Callum stepped back. On this mountain, Gideon said at length to Eliza, a man can only trust his own blood and his own Winchester. Our father used to say it. Our grandfather used to say it. We have said it to each other so many times that the words have worn smooth. He looked up. He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw beneath the carved, weathered face and the long, pale scar a man entirely present. Miss Whitmore, he said, you brought us the name of the man who killed our father and the woman I was going to marry. You brought it to our door at the precise moment we could finally do something with it. You did not bring trouble into this house. You brought us a reason to believe that a thing we had almost stopped praying about had been heard. Eliza's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. A Whitmore did not weep in front of strangers. Although she thought somewhere behind her discipline, the three men in this room were plainly no longer strangers. I am so sorry, Mr. Hayes, she whispered. Gideon, he said, the three of us share the name. You will need the given names to keep us straight. Gideon, she said. He inclined his head once gravely as though a small sacrament had been performed between them. They told her the rest of it then. The advertisement in the matrimonial news had been placed in Gideon's name by United States Marshal Cyrus Cook, oldest friend of their late father, chief lawman out of Denver. Gideon had recognized the looping hand on her reply letter the moment it had fallen from her pocket at the Cochran cabin. Cyrus, it seemed, had been watching Josiah Blackwood for some years in his own quiet way, and when Eliza's trail had come through St. Louis with a $5,000 bounty on it, he had made a decision. He had decided that the only place in the United States where Josiah Blackwood's young fugitive sister-in-law would be both safe and useful was in the hands of the three Hayes brothers on Silver Ridge. He had forged the advertisement. He had written the reply. He had, Gideon said, rather bet Eliza's life on a supposition about three men he had not seen in person for 5 years, and he had been correct. He was the closest thing to a second father, we had Ezra said it after. He stood beside our mother at our father's funeral. I believe he has been waiting 15 years for a way to put Josiah Blackwood on a rope. He will have it now, Callum said flatly. After a little while, Ezra sent his brothers out of the room because a patient who had just given a 3-hour account of her own family's destruction needed, in his professional opinion, to eat the bowl of broth and the dish of preserved peaches on the nightstand and to sleep again. She did all three. She did the last of the three, with his book open once more in the chair beside her, because she had asked him quietly if he might stay, while she closed her eyes and he had said, yes, Miss Whitmore, for as long as you like, and he had said it in such a simple, untroubled way that she had not felt foolish for asking. When she woke the second time, it was evening and she was stronger, and Callum Hayes was sitting in the chair where Ezra had been. Callum did not have a book. Callum had a whetstone and a hunting knife and a square of oiled leather, and he was putting an edge on the knife with the slow, patient attention of a man who liked his tools as sharp as an argument. He did not look up when she stirred. He only said without turning his head, you are going to eat a proper supper tonight, ma'am, and then I am going to teach you how to load a revolver correctly, because a rusted Patterson pointed at my brother with shaking hands is not a thing I intend to see on this mountain a second time. Eliza, to her own great surprise, laughed. It was a small laugh. It was the first she had produced in months. Callum looked up at the sound, startled, and his hard face broke for one unguarded instant into something almost boyish, and he looked away quickly as though caught. That is not funny, he muttered. You could have shot a Hayes. Your brother said my hammer was rusted shut, she said. Callum's mouth twitched. It was, but shaking hands can still find a trigger by accident, even when the hammer does not cock. And there is no version of this winter, Miss Whitmore, in which I am willing to let a woman defend herself with a weapon that will only half work. Tonight you eat. Tomorrow morning you learn to shoot properly, and that in its way was how the arrangement began. It was Gideon who laid it out plain at the long pine table in the main room on the evening of her 5th day in the cabin. Ezra had cleared the supper plates and poured coffee. Callum was cleaning the Winchester with a strip of flannel. Eliza sat wrapped in a heavy shawl Ezra had produced from a cedar chest that had belonged to their mother, and she looked between the three of them with her hands folded in her lap, the way her father had once taught her to fold them when she was being addressed by a magistrate. Miss Whitmore, Gideon said, until the pass is open in the spring, there is no safe way off this mountain. A woman alone with three unmarried men in a cabin on a high ridge is a thing people talk about, and talk travels faster than weather in the high country. We are going to ask you to stay here as our guest through the winter. You will have the upstairs bedroom. All three of us will sleep below. You are to cross no threshold we have not agreed upon, and we will cross none you have not agreed upon. When the pass is open, we will take you down to Denver ourselves and place you in that ledger in the hand of Marshal Cyrus Cook. Until then, you have our name and our roof. Eliza nodded slowly, and in return she said, you do not owe us anything in return, Ezra said gently. I disagree, Mr. Hayes, she said, and she said it so firmly that all three of them looked at her. She lifted her chin. I'm not a burden to be carried through a Colorado winter. My mother's mother was an Irish midwife out of County Cork. I was raised in a house where the judges' daughters were taught to cook and mend and set a bone because my father said a woman who could not do those things was helpless in the face of a world that did not care. I can read, I can write, a fair hand, I can keep accounts. I know the medicinal plants my grandmother carried with her off the ship. I can cook for 3 men and for 4. If you bring home a guest, and I have been told by more than one person in Boston that I make a respectable pot of beef tea. I will earn my keep in this house or I will not stay in it. Callum, wiping down the Winchester, said to the rifle, and not to Eliza, I could listen to a Boston woman describe herself for a living. Ezra said gravely, I think we have our answer, brothers. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He had not smiled in the whole conversation. He did not quite smile now, but the corner of his mouth, the corner with the scar beside it, lifted a fraction. On the mountain a man keeps his word, he said. The house of Hayes keeps its word. You have ours, Miss Whitmore, and we, I reckon, have yours. You have mine, she said. He nodded once. Then we are agreed, he said. And in the small warm room with the fire burning low, and the wind pressing at the thick paned window, and the pine needles of the high country ticking softly in the stove, something was set in place that none of them had expected to set in place, and all of them felt the setting of it, and none of them spoke of it because it did not yet have a name. The days that followed were the quiet days. They were, Eliza would think later, the best days she had lived through since her father had been alive, and she had not expected to find such days on a mountain, nor in the company of 3 men she had met by pointing a revolver at the eldest of them. She learned the cabin, the large main room with the stone hearth wide enough to roast a whole haunch of venison. The pine table, long enough for 6, though only 3 had ever sat at it. The shelves above the stove, where Ezra's well-worn copies of Gray's Anatomy and his mother's King James Bible shared a plank with a volume of Shakespeare, whose spine had been mended twice with leather thread, and a small stack of the novels of James Fenimore Cooper that Callum, of all people, had been rereading since boyhood and would not admit to. The upstairs bedroom that had been their mother's, Adelaide Hayes, who had died of the lung fever in the winter of 1870, in which the brothers had kept swept and aired as though for a guest they had never dared to name. She learned the daily work. She learned to cook over a wood stove, which was nothing at all like a Boston coal range. She learned under Ezra's patient instruction which of her grandmother's dried herbs could be steeped into a tea for a hunter's sore back, and which could be ground into a poultice for a rope burn. She taught him in return that the small white flour her grandmother had called feverfew could be boiled down to reduce the fevers of lung sickness, and Ezra, who had watched his mother die of the lung fever and never forgotten it, sat very still while she explained it to him, and at the end he said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Whitmore, I did not know that," and she understood that he had meant it in a way that went further than the herb. Callum was a harder country to cross. Callum was polite to her, and Callum was protective of her, But Callum was watching her. She understood this without resentment. Callum was the one who trusted no one, and he had the job by some unspoken division of labor among the brothers of being the last of the three to decide she could be trusted entirely. He took her as promised to the small, flat clearing behind the smokehouse on the morning of her sixth day in the cabin, and he taught her from the beginning how to load and fire a Colt single-action Army revolver with the weight and the balance of a real weapon. He stood behind her, not quite touching her, and he corrected the set of her shoulders with a few murmured words, and he did not laugh at her when her first shot went high into a pine, and he did not laugh at her when her fifth shot clipped the edge of the safety tin he had set up as a target, and when her 10th shot split the tin clean through the middle, he said simply, "Good," and he meant it, and Eliza, who had grown up in a house where praise was rationed, like wartime sugar, felt her face go warm with an unfamiliar kind of pleasure. Callum taught her over the following days how to read tracks in the snow. He showed her the deep print of a buck and the neat shallow print of a doe, and the difference between the pad of a lynx and the pad of a cougar, and the long stride of a lone wolf pushing through a drift. He showed her standing very still in the spruce above the creek. The small pressed disturbances that said a rabbit had passed here in the night, and the deeper prints that said a fox had passed here in pursuit. He taught her by slow, patient degrees to walk through the timber without speaking, because the high country, he said, told a person everything they needed to know if the person would only shut their mouth and listen. Ezra taught her by firelight. After supper, with the dishes cleared, and Callum at the window with his rifle and his novel, and Gideon at the hearth with a piece of pine and his knife, Ezra would draw up the chair opposite her and open one of the books from the shelf, and they would read to each other slowly for an hour before she went upstairs. They read King Lear together, taking parts. Ezra read Kent and Edgar. Eliza read Cordelia and the Fool. They read from the Song of Solomon, and Eliza was the one who had to look at the fire when they finished, because her grandmother had read it to her once as a girl, and she had forgotten how beautiful it was. They read from a worn little volume of the poems of Emily Dickinson that Ezra had bought in Philadelphia. And it was the night they read the poem about hope being the thing with feathers that Eliza, without meaning to, began to cry quietly into her tea, and Ezra, without making any fuss about it, simply handed her his handkerchief and went on reading in his soft, careful voice until the poem was done. And Gideon, by the hearth with his knife and his piece of pine, watched his brother read to the woman from Boston and did not speak. Gideon was the last to approach her. He had the furthest to come. He was the one who had loved and had buried what he loved and had sworn in the black winter of 1873 to close that door in himself forever. He was not a man who changed his mind lightly, but the woman was in his house, the woman was at his table. The woman had a way of setting the coffee cups on the tray after supper that reminded him in a way that was almost painful of the way his mother had set cups on a tray when he was a boy of 6, and Adelaide Hayes had sung under her breath while she did it. On the evening of the 9th day, when the others had gone to their bunks and only the two of them remained by the fire, Eliza sat down on the footstool beside his chair, and she asked him softly about the scar on his cheek. Gideon did not answer at first. He held his knife very still on the small pine carving he was making, which had begun to take the shape, though he had not admitted this to himself, of a doe. He looked at her a long moment in the red glow of the hearth. Then he told her about Petersburg. He told her about a splinter of shell that had come out of nowhere and opened his cheek to the bone when he was 16 years old. He told her that the regimental surgeon had sewn it up with a cobbler's needle by the light of a farrier's lantern, and that Gideon had held the lantern on himself so that the surgeon would have both hands free. Eliza listened. She did not interrupt. When he had finished, she said softly, "And Sarah?" He did not answer for a long time. "She was kind," he said at last. "That is the first thing I want to say about her. People always tell you that a woman was beautiful first. Sarah was beautiful, but she was kind. She was kind to me when I had come back from the war, and I did not know yet how to be inside a room with people. She would put her hand on the back of my hand at the dinner table when she saw me go somewhere else in my head. She never asked me to come back. She just put her hand on mine, and after a time I would come back on my own. because her hand was there. Eliza's eyes were full. She did not look away. I swore at her grave, Gideon said, that I would never love anyone again. I swore it because I could not bear to lose again. I thought at the time that I was making a promise to her, but I think now I was making a promise to myself, to the part of myself that could not stand any more losing. He turned the small pine carving in his hand. Miss Whitmore, he said. Eliza, she said. Eliza, he said. He said it as though trying the word for the first time. Eliza, I am not a young man. I am 34 years old and my face is marked, and my hands are not soft, and I have done very little in the last 10 years. But listen to the wind at night and wait for a thing I thought might never come. I do not know how to speak to a woman about what I am beginning to feel sitting here by this fire with you. I do not have the words. Then do not use any, Eliza said quietly. She reached up slowly so that he could stop her if he wished, and she laid her small hand over his large one where it rested on the arm of the chair. She let it rest there. She did not move it. He did not move his either. He only closed his eyes for one long breath, the way a man closes his eyes when he has been standing in the wind a long time and has finally come indoors. The small pine carving in his other hand shook just once. He steadied it. That, he said faintly, is a thing I did not think would happen again. I know, she said. They sat a long time by the fire without speaking. After a while, Gideon carefully finished the small dough, and he handed it to her, and she took it in both hands, and she set it on the shelf above the hearth beside Ezra's mended Shakespeare, where it would remain many winters later, long after both of them were old. When she went upstairs that night, Callum was still at his post by the window, though the novel had long since closed in his lap. He watched her climb the stairs with a candle in her hand. When she had gone, he looked over at his brother by the fire and he said nothing. He only lifted the corner of his mouth, the faintest acknowledgement that a thing had been seen and witnessed and approved. Then he went back to watching the dark line of the spruce beyond the window, because Callum Hayes did not forget, even for one evening, that somewhere down the mountain, a man in a tailored black suit was at that very moment making a list of the men he would send. The next morning, 13 days after Eliza had first come up, the ridge wrapped in another man's coat, Callum Hayes found a set of boot prints in the deep snow 2 miles below Three Pines cabin. They were fresh. They were 2 sets. They had been made by iron-shod city horses which had no business at all being on the ridge in winter. The prints had come in from the south along the old abandoned trapping trail, and they had stopped at the edge of the timber within rifle shot of the cabin, and they had turned and gone back down the mountain again, which meant only one thing. Someone had come up the ridge, seen the cabin and the smoke, and the 3 sets of boot tracks, and the 4 smaller set of boots tracks leading between the woodshed and the back door, and that someone had gone straight back down to tell a man in a tailored black suit what he had seen. Callum crouched in the snow over the prints a long moment. Then he straightened and he started back up the ridge at a lope that was almost a run, and when he came through the door of Three Pines cabin, breathing white smoke in the warm air, his face was a face his brothers had not seen on him since they were young men. Caleb Thorne has been here, Callum said. Him and one other. Probably Dutch Reaver. They stood in the spruce below the woodshed within the last day and a half. They saw everything. They did not come up. They went back down to Wire the Valley. Gideon was already on his feet. Ezra was already reaching for the medical bag he kept always ready by the door. Upstairs, Eliza, hearing the tone of Callum's voice through the floorboards, set down the coffee pot with hands that did not tremble because she had somewhere in the last 2 weeks become a different woman than the one who had first pointed a rusted Patterson at the eldest Hayes brother in the snow outside the Cochran cabin. She went to the top of the stairs. She looked down at the 3 men below her. They are coming, she said. It was not a question. They are coming, Gideon said. She drew a breath. She put her hand on the banister. She came down the stairs 1 step at a time, and when she reached the bottom, she went first to the rack beside the door, and she took down the heavy wool coat they had cut to fit her during the quiet days, and she put it on, and she lifted her chin. Then tell me what to do, she said. And the winter of 1883, which had been gathering its strength around Three Pines cabin for some days now, In a long, slow breath, finally at last exhaled. They came at first light the next morning. Callum had posted himself at the east window before the stars had faded, and he had not moved for 3 hours. He sat in his mother's rocker with the curtain drawn back, the width of one finger, the long sharps rifle across his knees, a tin cup of coffee cooling on the sill beside him. He did not drink the coffee. He had learned young that a man waiting for other men to come up a mountain did not drink coffee. A man waiting for other men to come up a mountain watched. Gideon was at the front door with the Winchester. Ezra was at the west window with the double-barreled coach gun from the wall, the medical bag at his feet because Ezra had understood long ago that in the Hayes household, he was both the last gun and the first surgeon, and that he would likely be needed to be both on the same morning. Eliza was in the loft above the main room lying flat on her stomach. On the pine floorboards, the Colt single-action army loaded and cocked on the planks beside her right hand, her blue eyes steady at the small loophole Gideon had cut into the loft gable years before for precisely this kind of morning. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Callum had laid it out the night before over the pine table maps and coffee cups and a small dish of lead shot for markers, and each of them knew where each of them would be when the killing started, and each of them knew what each of them would do if a particular one of them did not walk back into the cabin when it was finished. The killing would come. They all understood this. Caleb Thorne had not ridden away down the mountain to think about his feelings. It was Callum who saw them first. He saw through the narrow gap in the curtain the brief, dark shift of a horse's flank against the pale timber 600 yards below the cabin. Then another. Then a third. He did not speak. He only lifted his left hand slowly and showed 2 fingers and then 3, and then after a long pause a fourth. 4 horses, 4 riders. Caleb Thorne had come back with more than one man this time. He had come back with a crew. The lead rider halted at the tree line. Through the brass-mounted spyglass Callum kept on the sill, he saw the scar along the jaw where Callum had grazed him on a skirmish in the valley the autumn before. Caleb Thorne was back. Dutch Reaver sat his horse beside him, the right arm carried awkwardly where an old knife wound had never set quite right. And 2 men Callum did not know. Hired men. Range killers from down in the flats by the cut of their coats and the way they sat their horses. 4, Callum said softly into the quiet room. 3 of them are going to flank, Gideon said from the door. Caleb will parley first. That is his way. He likes to offer terms. Let him, said Callum. Caleb Thorne raised himself in the stirrups at the edge of the timber, and his voice came up the slope, clear and cold in the still morning air. Hayes, he called, you in the cabin. Hayes, Gideon did not answer. Gideon was listening for the flank. We only want the girl, Caleb called. And the book. Give us the girl and the book, and we ride out. You and your brothers keep your mountain and your pelts and whatever piece you got up there. You fight us on it, Mr. Hayes, and there will not be a Hayes left standing by sundown. You have my word on it. There was a long quiet. The wind moved the branches above the cabin, and the snow fell in small, soft parcels from the laden boughs. In the loft, Eliza did not move. She had been told by Callum in very plain terms that if she heard her own name called in the yard, she was under no circumstances whatsoever to call down. She watched. She breathed. She remembered a thing her father had said to her once at 11 years old when she had told him she was afraid of a dog in the alley. Fear is a hoarse little bird, her father had said. If you mount it, it will carry you. If you lie down under it, it will step on your throat. She mounted the horse. She watched the tree line through the loophole. Gideon spoke. He did not shout. He spoke only loud enough to carry because he wanted his voice to arrive as a decision rather than a passion. Caleb Thorne, Gideon said, my father was Thaddeus Hayes. Your employer put him in the ground 15 years ago. Your employer put Sarah Monroe in the ground 10 years ago. You tell Josiah Blackwood that I am done asking. You tell him the house of Hayes is closed for parley. Then he fired through the door. The first shot cleared the Stetson straight off Caleb Thorne's head. The second shot took one of the unknown hired men from the saddle before the man had even registered that the parley had failed, and the morning on Silver Ridge detonated into a roaring quick storm of lead and smoke. Dutch Reaver spurred his horse wide to the east, which was what Callum had expected him to do, because Dutch Reaver had always been the flanker, and that was why Callum had set himself at the east window with the long sharps. Dutch Reaver never made the east ridge. Callum squeezed the trigger once, and the sharp spoke with its slow, deep voice, and Dutch Reaver went backwards off his horse into a drift and did not get back up. The fourth rider, the second of the hired men, made the mistake of coming up the open slope at a gallop, firing a repeating pistol into the front wall of the cabin as he came. Ezra from the west window waited until the man was 40 yards from the porch, and then he let both barrels of the coach gun go at once, and the hired man went out of his saddle in a cloud of red, and the horse ran on past the cabin and stood later trembling at the hitch rail where it would be adopted into the haze string and live out its old age on grass in the Front Range Valley, though nobody in the cabin on that particular morning had the time to know that yet. That left Caleb Thorne. Caleb Thorne was not a fool. Caleb Thorne had seen 3 of his men go down inside of 40 seconds, and Caleb Thorne had worked for Josiah Blackwood long enough to know the difference between a mountain cabin held by 3 frightened trappers and a mountain cabin held by 3 Hayes brothers who had been turned out preparing for this particular morning for 15 years. He turned his horse. He drove spurs into its flank. He started down the trail at a hard gallop, flat to the neck, and it was then that Eliza Whitmore from the small loophole in the loft gable steadied the colt on the planks with both hands and put a single shot into the trunk of a pine not 10 inches from Caleb Thorne's right ear, and the bark splintered sideways and opened a bright, clean cut across his cheek, and he reeled in the saddle and nearly went off it, and he did not look back once as his horse carried him into the timber and out of sight. Gideon at the door lowered the Winchester slowly and looked up at the loft. Eliza was still there, the colt still set. Her face was very pale. Her hands now at last were shaking. "You put a mark on him," Gideon said quietly. "I did," she said. "I put it where he will see it in the mirror for the rest of his life, Mr. Hayes." "Good," Gideon said. "Now come down, ma'am. My brother needs doctoring." He did not curse. Gideon did not curse. He only said very quietly he will wire the valley. "He will," Callum said, already moving toward the door. Ezra was already across the room. Gideon had taken a shot through the meat of his left forearm. On the second volley, a clean pass through, no bone touched, and the bleeding was of the steady, patient kind that Ezra could stitch at his own table in 20 minutes. Ezra was stripping the sleeve of Gideon's coat back with the swift, economical movements of a man who had over many years learned to make his hands move when his heart did not wish to. In the loft, Eliza lowered the colt and set it very carefully on the planks, and she closed her eyes. She breathed once, then she went down the ladder. "Your brother is bleeding," she said to Ezra and then to Gideon. "I am going to boil water. Do you take anything in the way of whiskey, Mr. Hayes?" Gideon, sitting down hard on the pine bench while his younger brother probed his forearm with a pair of small steel forceps, looked up at her with an expression she would remember for years afterward. It was not pain. It was the look of a man who in the middle of an ordinary, ruined morning had just been handed something he did not deserve. "I might," he said, "if you are pouring." That night, when the bodies in the yard had been moved into the woodshed for the ground to receive them in spring, and the door had been barred with the oak timber kept for that purpose, and the brothers had laid a second cord of wood by the fire because the wind was coming up again. From the northwest, the 4 of them sat at the pine table, and they did a thing none of them had done at that table before. They held hands, and they said grace, and Ezra asked a blessing, not for the morning, which had been a hard morning, but for the woman who had been given to them by Providence and a United States Marshal, and for the mountain inn which had protected its own. And then they ate. They had 3 days. Perhaps 4. That was Callum's estimate, and Callum was not a man to overestimate his margins. Caleb Thorne had ridden down the mountain to wire Josiah Blackwood at whatever railhead office he was currently keeping. Josiah Blackwood would receive the wire. Josiah Blackwood would send this time not 4 men, but 15 or 20 because Josiah Blackwood was not a man who tolerated the failure of his smaller tools. And those men on fast horses breaking trail through the winter passes with Blackwood's railroad money behind them could be at the foot of Silver Ridge in as little as 4 days. They would not hold a cabin again. They all understood this. 3 guns against 20 was not a fight, it was a bill of sale. They had to move. They had to take the ledger to Cyrus Cook in Denver, and they had to do it themselves, and they had to do it before Josiah Blackwood's second crew arrived on the mountain to find them. That evening, while Eliza was upstairs washing her hair in the basin, Ezra sat at the pine table with 4 thick leather journals open in front of him, and a steel nib pen and a stone bottle of good black ink, and he copied the Blackwood ledger by hand 3 times over through the small hours of the night. He wrote in a neat compressed script and did not stop except to dip the pen. By first light, he had 3 identical true copies of the 8 entries of Josiah Blackwood's private business bound between plain covers. 3 copies. One to ride with each brother and the original to ride in Eliza's coat, because if all 3 brothers fell on the road to Denver, the original in her hand would be enough to hang the man in open court. Ezra did not say this part aloud. He did not have to. When he laid the 3 copies on the table at dawn beside the original in its oiled calfskin, Gideon looked at him a long moment, and Ezra looked back, and neither of them spoke. And everything that needed to be said was said. They burned nothing in the cabin before they left. This was Gideon's decision. The cabin had been their mother's house. The cabin had been their father's intention, and the cabin had been their 10-year refuge. And Gideon Hayes would not give the satisfaction of its burning to any man who came looking for them. The cabin would stand, or the cabin would fall, as the mountain decided. But it would not fall by the hand of a Hayes. They left it exactly as they had kept it. The small dough Gideon had carved for Eliza remained on the shelf above the hearth beside the mended Shakespeare. The pine needle pillow Ezra had stuffed for her bed remained upon the bed. The pot of coffee on the back of the stove was left half full. Eliza walked through the main room one last time, her hand trailing along the pine table, and when she came to the door, she stopped, and she turned and she looked at the room a long moment, and then she stepped out into the snow with the 3 Hayes brothers, and she did not look back because a Whitmore did not look back, and also because she already understood in the quiet place beneath her reasoning that she would see this room again one day under a different scheme. They broke from 3 Pines cabin in the black hour before dawn. 4 mounted figures on 4 of the brothers' best mountain ponies with a pack horse carrying the provisions for 10 days and a second pack horse carrying oats and lead. Callum rode point because Callum read country. Ezra rode drag because Ezra would stop for no patient but would stop for any brother. Gideon and Eliza rode in the middle stirrup to stirrup on the narrow trail, her gloved hand occasionally brushing his, where the path closed in, and neither of them commenting upon it, and neither of them moving the hand away. The sky that morning was the color of beaten pewter. The temperature at the cabin door had been 12 below zero. By mid-morning, when they crested the first ridge and turned south for the long, slow descent toward Wolf Creek Pass, the wind out of the northwest had picked up enough to make Ezra, at the rear of the column, turn up the collar of his buffalo coat and say quietly to nobody in particular, "We are going to pay for this weather before we see Denver." He was correct. Wolf Creek Pass in the winter of 1883 was not a road. It was an idea of a road half buried under 8 feet of drifted snow, switchbacked along the shoulder of the San Juan Divide at an altitude where the breath froze inside a man's beard, and the horse's lungs labored audibly with every step. It was the only pass that Blackwood's men coming up the valley would not be watching, because it was the pass no sane party took in December. The Hayes brothers took it anyway because sane was a luxury for later, and because Callum, when he had spread the map on the pine table the night before, had put one calloused finger on Wolf Creek and said, "If we live through it, nobody follows us over it." They lived through it. They lived through it for 7 days. 7 days of breaking trail through drifts that came to the horses' bellies. 7 days of blowing snow that reduced visibility to the tail of the horse in front of you. 7 days in which the temperature by Callum's pocket thermometer did not at any point rise above 0 Fahrenheit and fell on the third night to 30 below, a cold so profound that the ordinary sounds of the world were flattened and deadened, as though the mountain itself had been wrapped in felt. They slept in snow caves Callum cut with a short trenching shovel into the leeward sides of drifts. They ate jerked venison and hard biscuit and drank coffee boiled over a tiny stove that burned only the dry pine Callum could find beneath the trunks of deadfalls. They did not light large fires. They did not speak loudly. They moved in the economy of people who had understood that every word not necessary was a word paid for in breath and in body heat. On the third night, in a shallow, ice-walled cave above the timberline, while the other two slept wrapped in their buffalo robes, Gideon Hayes sat with Eliza beside the small blue flame of the camp stove and asked her a question he had not asked any person in 10 years. "What would you do," he said, "if you lived?" She looked at him over the rim of her tin cup. Her cheeks were windburned, and there was a small frost on her eyelashes, and she was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, which was a sentence he had not expected ever to think again, and which he did not intend to speak aloud. "If I live," she said, "slowly I will want a house. A real house, log, I think, with a porch, wide enough for 2 good chairs and a small table between them. I will want a garden. I will want to plant lilacs because my mother kept lilacs by the kitchen door in Boston, and I have not smelled them since I was 7 years old. I will want a barn with good light in it. I will want cattle because my grandmother said that if you had cattle, you were never poor. I will want," she said, and here she had to pause and take a slow breath, "I will want a child with whiskey eyes like yours, Gideon Hayes. A daughter if the Lord permits. A son if he does not. 2 of each would be better if I am asking, because I was an only sister once, and I have learned that 2 children in a house can be an entire world to each other, and I would like to give that." He did not answer at once. He was looking into the blue flame of the little stove, and the light of it lay along the scar on his cheek, and his jaw was set in a way that could have been mistaken by a person who did not know him for anger. It was not anger. Then that he said at length in a voice very low, "Is what we will have." Her eyes filled. She did not let them spill. She reached out her small, gloved hand, and he met it with his large one, and they sat that way a long time without speaking, and above them on the windward side of the cave the storm walked the ridge like a patient animal. "Winter always ends, Eliza," he said finally. "It is the only promise the mountain makes, and the mountain keeps it." "Winter always ends," she said. They came down out of Wolf Creek Pass on the evening of the 7th day into a sheltered park below the timberline, where the creek ran fast and black, between walls of ice, and Callum ranging ahead on foot, with the long sharps across his back, came loping back up the trail with an expression his brothers knew at once. It was the expression he wore when he had seen something that was about to require shooting. "6," he said quietly. "6 men, laid up in the pines above the creek ford with a clear field of fire on anybody coming down the trail. They have been there by the sign the better part of a day. They are waiting for us." How Ezra said. "I do not know how Callum said, but they are, and 6 is too many for 4 guns, 3 of which are on horses." Eliza, who had dismounted to rest her pony, was standing beside Gideon's stirrup. She looked up at him. She did not speak. He looked down at her and then across at Callum, and then for a long, quiet breath at the scar. "All right," Gideon said. "Then we split." They split where the trail forked above the creek ford. Callum and Ezra would take the left-hand fork, the visible open trail, and they would fire once loud to draw the ambushers out of the pines. Then they would run them east along the ridge, and they would cut and turn and cut and turn in the dense timber, and they would kill as many as fortune permitted, and would ride the rest into exhaustion. Gideon and Eliza, with the original ledger and 2 of Ezra's fair copies, would take the right-hand fork, the old trapper's track, a narrow game trail, that followed the creek on the far side, and they would ride hard for Alamosa, and they would not stop for anyone. "Sister-in-law?" Callum said to Eliza, and the words startled her so much that for a moment she could not answer. You see my brother to Denver, you understand. He is the last thing of our father worth preserving. I will see him to Denver, she said. Callum nodded once. He leaned from his saddle. He reached across and he touched her lightly on the shoulder with his gloved hand the first time he had ever touched her. And the gesture had in it the full weight of everything Callum Hayes did not say. Then he and Ezra turned their horses up the left fork, and the left fork took them in a hard canter into the pines, and within 3 minutes there came from among those pines the sudden dry crack of a sharps, and an answering storm of lesser shots, and then shouts, and then the diminishing thunder of a running fight moving east along the ridge. Gideon put his heels to his horse. Eliza put her heels to hers. They went down the right fork at a hard gallop, and they did not look back. They caught one of them 3 hours later in the long twilight above Alamosa. He was a young rider in a gray duster who had been pushed out of Callum's ambush by the sheer chaos of it, and who had ridden south in an attempt to rejoin Blackwood's main party, and who made the mistake, when he saw Gideon and Eliza break from the trees ahead of him, of reaching for the revolver on his hip rather than his reins. Gideon shot him clean through the right arm from the saddle at 60 paces, and when the young man was off his horse and sitting in the snow with his left hand clamped over his ruined right, and Gideon above him with the Winchester leveled at his throat, Eliza was the one who went through his coat and found the folded telegram from the railhead office at Alamosa. She read it. Her face, already pale with cold, went paler. Gideon, she said. She handed him the telegram. He read it by the last gray light of that short winter afternoon, and he read it slowly because he wanted to be certain of it. Josiah Blackwood was in Alamosa. Josiah Blackwood himself. Josiah Blackwood had come west on his private car on the northbound line with 12 men and Caleb Thorne, and he was waiting at the Alamosa railhead, and he was waiting, the telegram said, in his own hand to receive his wife's sister in person. Gideon folded the telegram. He put it into his coat. He looked at the young man in the snow. You ride, he said to him very quietly, out of this territory, and you do not stop until your horse drops under you. You find another line of work. You find a guy. You do not cross the Hayes name again. Do you understand what I am telling you, son? The young man, who was in fact no more than 19 years old, nodded frantically. Go, Gideon said. The young man got on his horse, left-handed and clumsy with pain, and he went, and they watched him go, and Eliza said softly at Gideon's stirrup, he means us to ride into the station with the ledger. He means to kill you in the yard and take me and the book and the body and board the eastbound train before there is a body in the yard to answer for. He does, Gideon said. Then we must not ride into the yard the way he expects, she said. They came into Alamosa the next morning in a light falling snow on foot, leading the horses with hats pulled low, and Eliza wrapped in one of the dead hired man's gray dusters, because at 50 yards at a glance under a hat, Eliza Whitmore in a man's gray duster looked to a watcher on a railroad platform like a fourth Hayes brother. They came up the alley behind the livery stable. They did not approach the railhead at all. They went instead to the small board-fronted office of the Western Union telegrapher, a cautious thin man named Asa Perriman, who had once in 1878 received free medical attention from one Dr. Ezra Hayes for his wife's difficult confinement, and who Ezra had told Gideon on the night before they left Three Pines cabin, specifically promised that should a Hayes ever come to his door, he would answer. Asa Perriman answered. Asa Perriman, upon being handed a brief note in the hand of Gideon, Hayes closed his office, locked the door, drew the blind, and sat Gideon and Eliza in his back room with a pot of coffee. Then he opened the telegraph key, and he sent over his own private circuit a single encoded message directly to the United States Marshal's office in Denver, addressed personally to United States Marshal Cyrus Cook. The message read, Hayes in Alamosa with package. Blackwood in Alamosa with 12 guns. Send who and what you can. Time is now. 98 minutes later, the reply came back. Cyrus Cook had read the message standing at his office window in Denver, and Cyrus Cook, who had been waiting 15 years, was at the moment of reading already in motion. The reply was 6 words long. Hold. Coming fast. Trust God. They held. They held through that afternoon and the long night and into the next afternoon in Asa Perriman's back room, with the coffee pot going cold between them and the shutters drawn, and Gideon's Winchester across his knees, and Eliza sitting very still beside him, with her small gloved hand resting on his forearm, not for comfort, but because she had understood some days back on the mountain that touching him lightly during the waiting was the only gift she could give him that he would accept. They held, and they did not speak much, and once Eliza rose and moved to the narrow back window and looked out past the edge of the drawn shade and saw across the rail yard on the polished mahogany vestibule of a private rail car painted the dark green of the Western Pacific Company, a man in a tailored black wool suit and a black bowler hat and a silver-handled walking cane, standing with his hands folded behind his back and surveying the yard with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and nothing to do with it but wait. Josiah Blackwood. She did not say his name aloud. She did not need to. Gideon had, from the tilt of her head at the window, already understood. He came to stand behind her. He put one large hand very gently on her shoulder. He looked past her at the man on the rail car. He did not speak. He is an ordinary-looking man, Eliza said softly. In all these months I had been imagining him larger. They are always ordinary-looking, Gideon said. That is the part they never tell you. At 4:18 on the second afternoon, the northbound whistle sounded from the Denver line, and a train that had not been on the printed schedule of the Alamosa dispatcher came in off the grade with unusual speed and unusual purpose. It was 2 cars only, a locomotive and a stock car. The stock car was not carrying stock. The stock car was carrying 21 mounted United States deputy marshals, and at their head, dismounting from the lead door, with the stiff old soldier's dismount of a man in his late 60s who had forgotten how to move any other way, was a tall, white-haired man in a dark blue wool overcoat with a silver star pinned above his heart. Cyrus Cook. Cyrus Cook had ridden for 18 hours on a private requisition train pulled by a locomotive he had commandeered on the written authority of the Department of Justice of the United States, because when Asa Perriman's wire had come into Denver, Cyrus Cook had not even sat down at his desk. He had walked straight out of his office. He had walked into the yardmaster's shed at the Denver depot, and he had laid on the desk a sheaf of federal warrants, 15 years in the signing, and he had said quietly, "And I need 2 cars and a fast engine, and I need them now." He had gotten them. Josiah Blackwood, on the vestibule of his private car across the Alamosa yard, was not an ordinary man, and he was not a stupid man, and he understood the moment the door of the stock car slid open and the first 4 mounted deputies came out of it at a trot, exactly what was happening and exactly how little time he had left. He turned. He said something quietly to Caleb Thorne beside him. Caleb Thorne drew his revolver. 4 of Blackwood's other men in long coats on the far side of the private car drew theirs. And Josiah Blackwood himself stepped down off the vestibule of the Western Pacific private car and walked not quickly toward the eastbound platform, as though the platform were in no particular hurry for him. It was then that Gideon Hayes, from the far end of the rail yard, stepped out of the alley beside Asa Perriman's telegraph office with the black ledger held up in his left hand for every man in the yard to see, and the Winchester lowered in his right hand, and called in a voice that carried across the yard the way his father's voice had once carried across a courtroom in Denver 15 years before the single sentence he had been saving for this moment for a decade and a half. "Josiah Blackwood," he said, "I believe this belongs to the United States government." And the rail yard at Alamosa, with one held breath, came apart. Caleb Thorne fired first. He fired wild because he was a man used to parley rather than pitched fight, and his shot went high and splintered a pine beam above Gideon's head. Gideon did not waste his answer. The Winchester came level, and the Winchester spoke once, and Caleb Thorne spun half a turn in the snow and went down on one knee with a red bloom across his right shoulder. He did not get up again from that knee, because in the same instant, Callum Hayes, who had broken off the running fight along the East Ridge in the dark small hours and had turned his horse south at a punishing gallop through the second night to reach Alamosa in the dark hours before dawn, stepped out from the doorway of the station master's shed with the long sharps across his forearm, and Caleb Thorne understood in what remained to him of his thinking life that he had been flanked by a haze for the second time in as many weeks, and then he did not understand anything further. Four of Blackwood's long coat men opened up from the far side of the private car. Two of Cyrus Cook's deputy marshals went down at the stock car door. The rest of them came out of that car at a run, the way old cavalry came out of a transport, and they fanned across the yard in a wedge, and their repeating carbines began to work in the disciplined short bursts of men who had drilled for exactly this kind of morning. Josiah Blackwood, halfway to the eastbound platform, turned and saw it, and he understood that the platform was no longer a route but a trap, and he changed direction and broke for the roundhouse at the north end of the yard with the long coat of his suit flying out behind him. Ezra Hayes was waiting at the roundhouse. Ezra had come down the south trail with his brother in the dark hours of the morning, and Ezra had gone immediately at Callum's direction to the roundhouse, because the roundhouse was the only structure at the Alamosa yard with cover and angles, and because the Hayes brothers had reasoned correctly that a cornered railroad man would run for iron and steam the way a cornered wolf runs for timber. Ezra stepped out from behind the great black flank of the resting locomotive with the double-barreled coach gun across his chest, and he called in his soft, careful doctor's voice that carried in the way his voice always carried when it needed to. "That is far enough, Mr. Blackwood. Set the pistol down in the snow. Set it down slow." Josiah Blackwood had a silver-plated revolver in his right hand, not drawn to fire, drawn to threaten, which was the difference between Josiah Blackwood and Caleb Thorne. Josiah Blackwood stopped. He looked at Ezra. He looked at the coach gun. He smiled the small, cold, private smile of a man who has spent his entire adult life finding the price of other men, and who has in that moment decided to find the price of this one. "Dr. Hayes," he said pleasantly, "I hear you are a reasonable man, the most reasonable of the three. I am prepared to hear in this yard to make you a very reasonable man indeed. $50,000. Cashier's drafts on 3 separate banks. You lower that gun, and I walk onto my car, and the Hayes brothers inherit a great deal of money, and no further inconvenience from me or from any man in my employ, forever, on my word." Ezra Hayes, who had sat with his mother through 3 months of dying, and who had carried his brother Gideon home over a saddle once when Gideon had taken a rifle ball in the thigh in the winter of 1875, and who had set the broken fingers of his brother Callum after a blacksmith in Leadville had taken exception to a remark, looked at Josiah Blackwood a long, quiet moment over the twin black eyes of the coach gun, and he said in that same soft, careful voice, "Mr. Blackwood, my father was Thaddeus Hayes, who was an honest banker in a dishonest town. My elder brother's betrothed was Sarah Monroe, who was kind. Their prices were paid. We are not in the market." Josiah Blackwood stopped smiling. Then he raised the silver-plated revolver. Ezra was already firing. Both barrels of the coach gun went at once, and at 9 feet it was not a close question. Josiah Blackwood, Chief Enforcement Officer of the Western Pacific Railroad, architect of 8 separate arranged tragedies across 15 years of quiet American killing, went backwards into the snow in front of his own roundhouse, with a look of mild, almost administrative surprise on his face, and he did not move again. The silver-plated revolver lay 3 feet from his hand in the powder. It had not been fired. It was not the ending any of them would have picked for him. Gideon, when he came up through the last of the gun smoke in the yard and stood looking down at the man who had killed his father, and his intended had wanted in the small, selfish place inside himself to see Josiah Blackwood hang at the end of a federal rope on a scaffold in Denver in open daylight. He did not get that ending. Ezra got a faster ending and a plainer one, and Ezra, standing over the body with the coach gun broken open in his hands to eject the spent shells, looked up at his elder brother and said simply, "He drew on me, Gideon." And Gideon said quietly, "I know, Ezra. I saw." But before Ezra had fired in the minute before across the yard where the worst of the fighting had been, Something had happened that Gideon Hayes would carry for the rest of his life. Ezra had been pinned at the roundhouse doorway by two of Blackwood's long coat men firing from the corner of the coal shed. Ezra, who was a fine man with a coach gun at close quarters, was not a rifleman, and the long coat men had him boxed. And into that minute from the alley behind the station master's shed had come Callum Hayes at a dead run, the sharps across his back, the Colt in his hand, and Callum had opened the two long coat men from 20 feet away with four shots placed as precisely as letters in a legal document. And Callum had taken in the course of placing those four letters a heavy slug through the meat of his own upper chest, left side high, an inch below the collarbone. He had gone on another 5 strides after the slug hit him because Callum Hayes did not stop for a slug when a brother was boxed. Then he had sat down in the snow with his back against the wall of the station master's shed, and he had calmly put his gloved hand over the wound to slow the bleeding. And he had called, not loudly in a voice that only the people who needed to hear it heard Ezra, "I need you a minute when you are free." Ezra was free 30 seconds later when Josiah Blackwood went down in front of the roundhouse. Ezra came at a run. He dropped the coach gun. He was on his knees in the snow beside Callum in the time it took Eliza Whitmore emerging at last from the telegrapher's office with the original ledger clutched to her chest to cross half the yard to them. "Not my heart," Callum said conversationally to Ezra as his younger brother ripped open his coat. "It is high. I can still lift the arm. Stop looking at me like that. I was going to need a new shirt anyway." Ezra Hayes, who was normally the calmest of the brothers, did a thing in that moment that he did only twice in his life. He laughed and he cried at the same time while his fingers worked swift and certain inside the ruined wool of his brother's shirt. "High," he said, "yes. High and through. No lung. You large idiot. You enormous idiot." "Hold still. Hurry," Gideon said at his shoulder. Eliza, who had been raised in a judge's house and knew how to make herself useful in a room of bleeding men, was already stripping the silk scarf from inside her collar to make a pressure pad. Cyrus Cook, coming up at a fast old soldier's walk across the yard with the silver star on his coat dulled by gun smoke, was already calling for the medical kit from the stock car. Callum Hayes lived. Ezra stopped the bleeding in 11 minutes. Ezra redressed the wound in the back room of Asa Perriman's telegraph office half an hour later by a proper lamp with Cyrus Cook standing at the door and refusing to let any deputy marshal enter the room until Dr. Hayes was finished. Callum, who in the course of those 11 minutes had lost a pint and a half of blood and had teased his brother 3 separate times about the quality of his field stitching, fell asleep on Asa Perriman's narrow cot 20 minutes after that, holding Eliza Whitmore's hand in his good right hand, and he did not wake until the following dawn. Cyrus Cook, when at last the yard was secured and Blackwood's surviving men were chained hand and foot in the stock car for transport, came into that back room with his blue eyes old and bright and a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket that had been folded there. Eliza understood, watching him for a very long time. "Boys," Cyrus Cook said very quietly. His eyes went over Callum on the cot and Gideon standing beside him, and Ezra washing his hands in a basin of red water, and he did not speak for a full half-minute, which in the economy of Cyrus Cook was a eulogy. "Your father," he said at last. "Your father 15 years ago, in the week before he was killed, asked me to hold a letter for you. He did not name the occasion. He only said, 'Cyrus, if a day ever comes when my boys have put their mother's killers in the ground, and they are standing together over it, and all 3 of them are still breathing, that is the day you give them this letter. If that day does not come,' he said, 'then burn it and do not speak of it.'" He paused. His voice was steady, but Cyrus Cook's old blue eyes were not. "Boys," he said, "this is the day." He drew the paper from his coat. It was a single sheet folded 3 ways, sealed once in red wax with the old Hayes seal, a small, clean Greek letter stamped into the wax by a ring Thaddeus Hayes had worn on the little finger of his left hand for 30 years and had at some point in the last week of his life pressed into a drop of red wax on this letter. And then Cyrus Cook said, taken off his finger and given to the marshal, saying, "Cyrus, hold this for Gideon, along with the letter, and do not open either one." Gideon Hayes took the letter in a hand that was after everything quite steady. He broke the seal. He opened the single sheet. The handwriting on it was a hand he had not seen in 15 years. It caved something inside him quietly in the center of his chest, the way a good timber beam caves under snow at last, without warning and without fuss. He began to read aloud because his brothers needed to hear it and he needed to say it, and there was no version of that room in which any one of the three of them read the letter alone. My sons, Gideon, Callum, Ezra. If you are reading this, you have already done the hard thing, and you have done it together, and you have come out the other side of it still standing. I do not know the shape the hard thing will take. I only know the shape of the men I raised, and I know that whatever is sent against you, the three of you together will find its weak place and put the edge of an axe into it. I want to say two things to you. The first is that you must not become lonely men. I have seen lonely men. I have buried some of them. A lonely man can live a long time, but he cannot live a large life, and I did not raise my sons to live small. Find women worth keeping, build houses worth burning lamps in, put children into those houses. If the Lord grants you those things, you will know what I mean. If he does not love each other well enough to be a family of three, and do not let the silence win. The second is that I am not sorry for the work I did. I would not sell the land. You three know why. What a banker in a frontier town sells 1,000 other men cannot afterward buy back. I would not sell it, and the men who wanted it sent a man who wore a tailored black suit and carried a silver-handled cane, and that man, I expect, is the man you have answered for me tonight. Good. Do not let any man in a tailored black suit tell any of you ever that the work of an honest banker or an honest doctor or an honest hunter is a small work. It is the only work. Every town in this country was built on it. Every town that forgets it will be sold a piece at a time to men in tailored black suits until there is nothing left. Gideon, you are the eldest. You are the steady one. Lead them, but do not crush them, and do not forget that a brother needs a brother more than he needs a captain. Callum, you are the one who feels the most and says the least of it. Let someone in, son. The mountain cannot be your wife. I know you have tried. Ezra, you were a boy when I wrote this, but you were already the best of us. Put that medicine back to work. It was not meant to stop at 2 years. Finish what you started. I love you three more than the mountain we live on, and the mountain is a great deal. Your father, Thaddeus Hayes. Denver, the 8th of March, 1868. Gideon's voice did not break. It did not break because Gideon Hayes had, over the course of the previous 15 years, practiced not breaking until not breaking was the only thing he could still reliably do. But when he finished reading and he looked up and he saw his brother Callum propped on the narrow cot with tears running sideways across his temples into his dark hair, and he saw his brother Ezra sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his washed red hands open on his knees and his face turned up to the ceiling in the quiet old private way that Ezra had inherited from their mother Gideon. Hayes finally, at 34 years old, 9 years after Sarah Monroe had gone into a coffin in a Denver churchyard, allowed the last door to come open inside himself. He did not weep loudly. Gideon did not weep loudly, but he wept at last, and his tears were the straight, patient tears of an honest man, relieved at long last of a debt he had never been able to speak aloud. Eliza Whitmore, at the foot of the narrow cot, went to him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She put her arms around Gideon Hayes where he stood, and she held him. And Gideon, after a moment, put his arms around her, and he laid his scarred cheek into the honey-colored hair at the crown of her head. And the four of them were very still in that small lamp-lit room, while outside in the snow-lit yard, the Department of Justice of the United States quietly completed the business of taking the body of Josiah Blackwood into evidence. Cyrus Cook, standing at the door with the ring still in his palm, a small plain gold band set with a single garnet that Thaddeus Hayes had worn every day for 30 years, closed his hand around it and cleared his throat, and he said in a voice thicker than he was used to, letting it be, son, your father wanted you to have this. Your mother picked it in 63 when you were on your way home from the war. They never told you. He turned it once in his palm, put it on, give it to somebody who deserves to see it there. Gideon took the ring. He did not put it on. He held it in his open palm and he looked at it, and he looked at Eliza, and Eliza looked back at him in the plain, simple way she had looked at him on the third night in the ice cave, and nothing needed to be said because everything already had been. 3 months later, in April of 1884, the federal court sitting in Denver convened the case of the United States of America against the estate of Josiah Blackwood, deceased, and 16 named officers of the Western Pacific Railroad. The Black Ledger, authenticated by Clara Whitmore Blackwood's own preserved correspondence and corroborated by 23 witnesses brought up from every corner of the West, was admitted into evidence on the third morning of the trial. The public reading of the entries took an afternoon. The entry for Thaddeus Hayes was read aloud at 2:17 in the afternoon. The entry for Sarah Monroe was read aloud at 2:21. Gideon Hayes, seated in the third row with Eliza Whitmore on his right and Callum and Ezra on his left, did not move through either reading. He had done his weeping in Asa Perriman's back room. He was here now to listen. The jury was out for 11 minutes. The verdicts came back in the block. The estate of Josiah Blackwood was ordered dissolved and its proceeds distributed as restitution to the families of the identified victims and their heirs. 16 named railroad officers were convicted of charges ranging from conspiracy to first-degree murder. 4 were sentenced to hang. The remaining 12 drew prison sentences of between 15 years and life. The Western Pacific Railroad itself was placed into federal receivership for the remainder of the calendar year of 1884, and its books were opened to public inspection for the first time in its corporate history. The United States government, through the office of United States Marshal Cyrus Cook, awarded the Hayes brothers and Miss Eliza Whitmore a collected federal bounty of $20,000 for the retrieval and delivery of the Blackwood Ledger. President Chester A. Arthur, in the last winter of his administration, signed the warrant of reward personally in blue ink and wrote beneath his signature in his own careful hand with the thanks of a grateful republic. They did not go back to Three Pines cabin. The cabin, when a cautious ranger party rode up to check on it in the first week of the spring thaw, was still standing. The pot of coffee on the stove was frozen solid. The small pine dough still sat on the shelf above the hearth. A family of pack rats had taken up residence in Ezra's cedar chest. The Hayes brothers instructed the ranger party to leave the door wired shut, but otherwise untouched, and to report that any man on any subsequent summer should attempt to claim it, and they did not return to it themselves. They had a different house to build now. They bought with a portion of the federal bounty, and the remainder of their silver claim proceeds a long, gentle valley of grass and cottonwood and on the front range below Fort Collins, Colorado. It had a good creek and a good southern exposure and a barn half fallen down that Callum said he could have standing again in 3 weeks with the right 3 men, and he did, and he was one of the 3 men. They named the place Whitmore Hayes Ranch because a Hayes did not take a wife's name into the dirt without honoring the name he was taking, and because a Whitmore, as Eliza's grandmother from County Cork had once said, was a name that had earned its letters. They carved it into a lintel over the main gate, and they hung the lintel in July of 1884, and the paint was not quite dry when Ezra and Callum lifted Eliza up onto Gideon's shoulders so that she could press her small palm into the last wet corner of the letter H for luck. They married at the ranch in August. It was a small wedding. Cyrus Cook stood up with Gideon. Callum and Ezra stood on the groom's side. Eliza, who had no living family remaining, asked Asa Perriman and his wife to stand up for her, and they did because Asa Perriman believed a debt paid in medicine was a debt paid in blood. The circuit preacher read the passage from Ecclesiastes about a cord of 3 strands, and Gideon placed his father's small garnet ring resized by a jeweler in Denver for a smaller finger on the 3rd finger of Eliza Whitmore's left hand, and Eliza placed a plain pine ring whittled by her husband in the evenings of their engagement on the third finger of Gideon Hayes's left hand because she did not want him wearing a ring she had not made with her own hands in some fashion. And because Gideon, when she had told him so, had only nodded once gravely as though a sacrament had been spoken. The door closed that night on the first small cabin they had raised at the ranch, and the first real snow had not yet fallen, and the lilacs Eliza had planted beside the kitchen door in May were already as high as her waist. And when the sun came up the next morning, the two of them stood on the porch together and watched the light move across the valley, and Gideon Hayes put his arm around his wife's shoulders and said quietly into her hair, "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes." "You are home now," Eliza said. "We both are. We are exactly where we belong." "Winter always ends," he said. "Winter always ends," she agreed. The years after that went the way good years go when a person is paying attention. They came quickly, and they did not feel quick. The first child came in the summer of 1885, a daughter. Gideon held her for a long time without speaking, standing at the window of the bedroom, while Ezra packed his medical bag, and Eliza slept in the bed behind them. And when Callum put a hand on his elder brother's shoulder, Gideon said quietly, "Sarah Clara Hayes," because Sarah was a Whitmore grandmother's name out of County Cork. And Clara was the sister who had thought of her little bird even at the end, and the baby blinked up at her father with eyes that were not yet any color, but that would in their own time come in the color of whiskey held up to a lamp. Ezra married Cordelia Bradley in the spring of 1886. Cordelia was the only daughter of old Dr. Bradley of Fort Collins, who had, upon meeting Ezra Hayes at a cholera outbreak in the summer of 1885, looked his prospective son-in-law up and down once and said, "Well, young Dr. Hayes, I suppose you will do," and had signed over the practice 3 weeks later and retired to fish. Ezra, who had finally completed his medical degree by correspondence with the University of Pennsylvania in the winter of '85, opened the Hayes Medical Clinic out of the old Bradley rooms, and he kept it open every weekday and every other Saturday for the rest of his working life. Callum married Meredith Sutton in the autumn of 1887. Meredith was a red-haired school teacher from the Fort Collins Church Choir who had, over the course of one long summer, patiently and stubbornly refused to be frightened of Callum Hayes, and who had at the harvest dance taken his hand in both of hers and told him that if he was waiting for her to let him out of her company again, he was going to be waiting a considerable time. Callum, who had not been spoken to in that manner by a woman ever, had surrendered within the first 16 bars of the next waltz. They built a smaller house down the valley from the main house. Meredith taught their children to read from the same King James Bible that had sat on the shelf at Three Pines Cabin. Silas Thaddeus Hayes came in 1886, Elias Alistair Hayes in 1889, Rowena Adelaide Hayes in 1894. By the time the last of Gideon and Eliza's 4 children was walking the Hayes stables under Callum's patient management, were supplying cavalry mounts to 2 separate United States forts, in the Hayes Medical Clinic, under Ezra's quiet care, had delivered a third of the children in Larimer County under the age of 10. The lilacs grew as high as the kitchen window. 20 years passed in the way 20 years pass. In the late afternoon of the first Sunday of October, 1904, a long black carriage came up the lane to the main house at Whitmore Hayes Ranch. Eliza Hayes, 44 years old now, with silver threading the honey at her temples and a small pair of reading glasses pushed up into her hair, saw it from the porch and set down the bowl of peas she was shelling and stood up slowly. "Gideon," she called through the screen door. "Gideon it is, Cyrus." Gideon Hayes, who was 54 years old and who had a full beard gone iron gray, and who had given up 2 winters back the business of riding fence in weather, under 20 degrees, came out of the back of the house drying his hands on a cloth. He stood beside his wife on the porch as Marshal Cyrus Cook, 81 years old and retired these 10 years from federal service, came down the carriage step with the stiff old soldier's care of a man who was no longer young, but had refused stubbornly and yearly to be old. Cyrus had something in his arms. It was wrapped in a piece of soft green baize. He came up the porch steps. He set the object down on the little table between the 2 chairs. He took off his hat. He looked at Eliza Hayes a long moment with his old blue eyes, which had over the course of the last 2 decades quietly gone the color of spring sky. Mrs. Hayes, he said. Mrs. Hayes, I believe I owe you something and I am getting, he said, as you can see, somewhat old to be carrying debts. Eliza did not speak. She could not. She had already seen the shape of the object under the baize. She had known that shape for 28 years. She had last seen it when she was 16 years old on the dressing table of her mother 2 weeks before her mother had died of the wasting fever. Cyrus Cook drew back the green cloth. It was a rosewood music box the size and shape of a large loaf of bread inlaid with a small mother of pearl, rose on its lid with a small brass key in the side and the initials ECW, etched into a small silver plate on the top for Elizabeth Corinne Whitmore, Eliza's mother. The hinges had been newly oiled. The cloth inside the lid had been newly replaced. Cyrus Cook, had Eliza understood without being told, spent the better part of a year on its restoration. Josiah Blackwood. Cyrus said quietly, kept it in a private vault in a bank in New York. The estate took it in '84. It moved through 3 auctions. It was sold in '97 to a family in Albany who did not know what it was. It took me, he said, 7 years to find it after I retired. I have, he said, had some time. Eliza reached out. Her hands at 44 were steadier than they had been at 23 in the snow outside the Cochrane cabin. They did not shake now. They settled on the rosewood lid and they lifted it. The small brass mechanism began to turn. It played Beautiful Dreamer in the slow, uncertain way of a music box that has lived a long life and has been loved through most of it. And at the first 3 notes, Eliza Hayes, who had been Eliza Whitmore, and who had been on the afternoon of a November day in 1883, a 23-year-old woman, weeping on her knees in the snow in front of a collapsing cabin on a mountain whose name she did not know, put her hand over her mouth the way her mother had once taught her to do when she did not wish the world to hear her weep. Gideon Hayes put his arm around his wife's shoulders. He did not speak. He looked past her at the old marshal, and he nodded once gravely as the Hayes men nodded when a very great thing had been done. Behind them through the screen door, Saria Clara Hayes, 20 years old that summer, and home for a weekend from the teacher's college in Denver, began to play the same melody on the upright piano in the parlor, picking out the chords from memory, because her mother had hummed the tune to her every night of her childhood without ever once explaining where the tune had come from. It was Thanksgiving, 2 weeks later. The long table that Callum had built that spring ran the length of the great room of the main house, and it seated 21 Hayes that afternoon. Gideon at the head, Eliza at the foot, Callum and Meredith in their 3 down one side, Ezra and Cordelia, and their 2 down the other, the 4 Hayes children ranged where they fit Cyrus Cook and Asa Perriman in the places of honor on either side of Eliza, because a Hayes and a Whitmore did not sit down at a board on that day without the 2 men who had between them given them the board. Eliza had cooked for 3 days. She had cooked, among many other things, a beef tea in her grandmother's old copper pot, which Gideon Hayes took 2 servings of, because a Hayes also did not forget a promise, and because she had promised him, in the autumn of her 24th year, a respectable pot of beef tea if he ever got her through the winter. The prayer was said by Ezra. It was a plain prayer. It was not long. Before the meat was cut, Gideon Hayes, who did not speak long at table, and who had not made a speech in public since the spring of 1865, tapped his knife once on his water glass. The long table quieted. 31 years ago this week, Gideon said, my brother Callum and my brother Ezra and I climbed up a ridge in the San Juan Mountains carrying a woman between us who was 2 hours from dying. We thought at the time that we were saving her. We were, on the other hand, being saved by her, though none of us understood it. He looked down the table. He looked at his wife. He looked at his brothers. He looked at his 4 children, and at the 3 children of Callum and Meredith, and at the 2 children of Ezra and Cordelia, and at Cyrus Cook, who was looking down into his plate in the quiet way he did now, when his eyes were full, and at Asa Perriman, who was also looking into his plate. I used to say, Gideon went on, and his voice was steady, that on the mountain a man can only trust his own blood and his own Winchester. My father said it to me. His father said it to him. I will tell you now, wrong. A man can trust a great deal more than that if the Lord is kind to him. A man can trust, he said, the hands of a woman who has chosen him. A man can trust, he said, the love of his brothers and their wives. A man can trust, he said, the laughter of children who are his own by blood or his own by the plain, simple fact that they were born under his roof. A man can trust, he said, an old friend who waited 15 years to put the worst man in the territory onto a rope, and then waited 7 more to put a music box into the hands of its rightful owner, because that is who that old friend is. A man can trust, he said, and his voice did a thing it rarely did now, but that was allowed to it on this day, the ending of a winter. Winters always end, he said. That is the only promise the mountain makes. And in my experience, he said, the mountain keeps it. He lifted his glass of cider. He looked at his wife at the other end of the long table. Mrs. Hayes, he said. Mr. Hayes, Eliza said. You are home, he said. I am home, she said. We all are. We are exactly where we belong. Around the long table, the 21 Hayes raised their glasses. The fire in the great hearth was the fire that Callum had built that morning out of split pine brought down out of the Rockies the week before. It popped once cleanly in the way a good pine fire does when it has warmed to its work. The winter of 1883, friend, is a long time ago now. The 3 Hayes brothers have been gone, every one of them, for many years. Cyrus Cook outlived his retirement by 6 years, and he was buried by his own last direction between Thaddeus Hayes and Sarah Monroe in the Denver churchyard, with a small military headstone that says, "Only Cyrus Cook, United States Marshal, he kept his word." Three Pines cabin stood empty on its ridge for 41 years until a lightning strike took it in the spring of 1924, in a fire so clean and quick that the small pine doe on the shelf above the hearth was found intact a week later by a park ranger and is kept now in a glass case in the small historical museum in Telluride. The ranch in the Front Range Valley is still there, still called Whitmore Hayes, still worked by the great-great-grandchildren of Gideon and Eliza. The lilacs, when last I rode by, were as high as the kitchen roof. If you go up into the San Juans on a November afternoon, friend, when the first green wood smoke is rising somewhere in a ravine and the first true storm is gathering in the west, and you stand still on the ridge above the old Cochrane, claim you can hear, if the wind is right, a faint melody carried on it, the way a music box might sound, if a music box could be carried by weather. It is beautiful dreamer. It is not sad. It is the sound I have come to believe of a promise being kept. The mountain made that promise 140 years ago this winter to a woman from Boston who walked 3 miles through fresh snow to reach a cabin that turned out not to be the cabin she had been promised, but was instead the cabin she had been sent. Winter always ends, friend. That is the promise. And in my experience, as it was in Gideon Hayes, the mountain keeps it. Thank you for riding along with me tonight. If this story has sat with you, take a moment and hit that like button and subscribe if you have not already, because I tell one of these every week stories of the wild country and the men and women who earned it with their own 2 hands. And before you ride on, leave a comment and tell me where you were listening from tonight, and tell me, if you will, the name of a person in your own life who was as Eliza Whitmore was to the 3 Hayes brothers on the shoulder of Silver Ridge, the right soul sent to you at precisely the right hour. Till next time, friend, you are home now. You are exactly where you belong.